All right, thank you. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to the PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join ongoing solidarity work. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with us. And as usual, please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. The recordings are available on CPE's YouTube channel. I think a retrospective of our PSAs would likely map a series of tectonic shifts in our political terrain from month to month and even week to week this year. Heading into today's PSA, we expected to and will spend time discussing the prospect that Joe Biden will be stepping out of the race for president. The implications that Biden, who has vociferously embraced Zionism throughout his decades in office, famously admitting the U.S. would have to invent a state of Israel as an outpost for imperialist interests if one had not already been invented by UN mandate, and whose actions throughout Israel's genocidal campaign can be described only as fully complicit, are difficult to underestimate. How a change in candidates for the Democratic Party changes the political terrain for Palestine solidarity, however, isn't just straightforward. But I would argue it does raise important questions and critical opportunities for the left on the question of Palestine and on several questions that center working class needs and demands, both in the immediate and long term. All of that discussion on what's been on the table for the working class has been subordinated to Biden's constant gaffes and political bouts of confusion. Notwithstanding how important Biden's potential recusal is, we've had incredibly significant news regarding Palestine every day this week. Mass killings and atrocities, indications that starvation and disease have worsened still, ongoing bombings by Israel in Lebanon, and just a few days ago, a retaliatory Yemeni drone strike in Tel Aviv, and just a few hours ago, a historic ICJ decision declaring that Israel is engaging in apartheid and calling on states like the US to stop aiding Israel's unlawful presence in the Palestinian territories. As usual, we'll be joined by Samar Arabi from Iraq to review all these developments, but in the meantime, let's start with a semantics grounding from Melissa Fan.
Hey everyone, thank you for being here today. I want to take a brief moment to talk about numbness. A lot of people have been expressing this general sense of numbness in the past few months and the difficulty in navigating through it. So first, I want to say that's normal. I've also been experiencing that to varying degrees. Numbing out is your body's way of protecting you from harm. And witnessing the genocide in Palestine is absolutely good reason to numb out. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Simply witnessing one day of the atrocities in Gaza is enough trauma to metabolize for a lifetime. It's been 75 plus years. So numbness absolutely is a wise response from your body. And we can't stay there. We absolutely cannot stay there if we want collective liberation, because liberation requires your whole self. In order for us to take consistently aligned action, we have to feel. We have to feel. Numbness doesn't discriminate between grief and joy. Numbness affects your intuition and your internal moral compass. That's why we practice somatics. That's why we have to make the conscious decision to feel, even when the feeling is awful, unbearable. And the feelings of grief, rage, horror, despair, helplessness will absolutely feel unbearable given the scale of atrocity in Palestine. And if we zoom out to what's happening around the world, yeah, it's immense. The grief is immense. But we're not holding it alone. We are in this together. So let's feel, let's practice. All right, so finding your body, just tuning into your body right now as it is, simply noticing the sensations in this moment, noticing where your attention is going. If you're in your head, or if you're able to drop down to feel the rhythm of your heartbeat, the pace of your breathing. Last week, we did a practice of centering in our width, the dimension of community. So let's do that again. So right here, just finding the sides of your body. Yeah, it might help to rub the sides of your body, sides of your arms, your legs, or tap. Just noticing the sides of your body, allowing yourself to take up a little bit more space in your width. And here, toggling a little bit, noticing how your energy extends to your left side and extending to the right side. And this dimension of width is the dimension of community. Yeah. So feeling now as you're extending your energy to your sides, your community, the people who you can feel with. Maybe identifying one or two people that you can practice being and feeling together with. Noticing that if you're feeling numb, you can say, hey, I've been feeling really numb. Can we figure out a way to thaw a little bit together? And just sending a little bit of energy, sending energy out through the sides of your body to your community. And receiving that energy back into knowing that people are extending to you. There are people who care about you, who love you, who want to hold you. Just returning to this practice, even during this call or at any time when you're feeling overwhelmed. We can do this together. We can feel. Thanks for practicing with me today.
Thanks, Melissa. Always appreciate your somatics groundings, and they often reveal some unexpected aspects of continuing to do this work. And I think it's an important reminder to continue to avoid and or to engage in practice that helps us to work through the numbness, and to stay focused and engaged in the work. Um, with that, let's bring up Samer. Samer, yeah, I mean this whole centuries and in days quote feels apt in this moment, and I feel like we saw a lot this week. So let's get started on some of these updates, and then maybe you and I can talk a little bit about where things stand with the Biden campaign and how that might impact solidarity work moving forward. Welcome back.
Thanks, Thomas. That's yeah, that quote had been bouncing in my head all week that, this is one of those weeks where decades happen. So and really appreciative of that grounding because I am feeling overwhelmed. So it's good to have a little bit of space to process that before diving into all the things. What a week. My goodness, what a week. As folks are probably particularly aware this time, it's been a really violent week in Gaza. A whole series of massacres that have, some so large that they've eclipsed the others. The official death toll ticked up about 500 again, which is similar to the week before. But the places we're seeing it are really something uh, that speaks to a kind of deepening shift of the way that these mass atrocity events are happening. So as we've been doing lately, we're starting at the bottom of Gaza and working our way up. So the Israeli offensive in Rafah, the southern border city, had been stalled for a little while, but now it is moving forward. So, I think when we checked in a couple weeks ago about it, they had occupied about half the city. And it's hard to know the numbers right now, but that offensive is continuing now. So they're moving into parts of Rafah that they hadn't reached before. While they're doing this, there's a whole bunch of funkiness that's happening on the border, where not only was there, Axios calls it a scoop, but whenever there's an Axios scoop, it's really just a Biden administration leak. A strategic leak that Israel and the Palestinian Authority are meeting to discuss transitioning power to the Palestinian Authority over the border, specifically just the Rafah crossing. It's happening in this context of the US clearly wanting to start transitioning control to the PA generally, and this being a preliminary step that once again, like Netanyahu just spitting in the face of that whole process. So they met with, apparently at US urging, the Israelis met with the PA to discuss not transferring control. It turns out the Israeli said, you can come to the border as observers. And the PA said no. So Netanyahu himself went to the border and basically said that control of that border is critical for the next stage of the war, meaning that under no circumstances is he willing to transfer control of that border crossing yet, which unsurprising and also apparently turns out to have been one of the negotiated pieces of the ceasefire agreement. So in the agreement that, Biden has repeatedly said that the Israeli government has already accepted, part of that is the full transfer of border control and the Israeli withdrawal from that border. So again, he's sort of poking a finger in the eye of the ceasefire process, and we'll come back to that in a minute when we get to the ceasefire updates. In the middle of Gaza, another set of really horrible bombings. A number of schools have been hit. This is the sixth, and I think since this has come out, there's actually been 7 UN-run schools in Gaza that have been attacked in the past 10 days, each one of which has led to, I think, at least 10 or so people being killed. But the real tragedy of this week in central Gaza and in Gaza generally was the El Mawasi bombing, which has killed at least 90 people. There's a lot we still don't totally know about how this all played out, but basically Israel dropped a series of extremely large munitions on a designated safe zone and humanitarian area. And they claim that they did it to target Mohammed Deif, which is one of the key like Hamas senior leaders. They've said this like a dozen times now, and once again, they're not even claiming that they actually got him. They're just using it as a justification for the bombing itself. There's a lot in this bombing that, if you have the heart, I encourage you to read this Mondo Weiss piece, which has some really powerful testimony of the people who were there. But one of the things that I wanted to point to was people doing sort of forensic investigations into the bombs used in that bombing. And from what's been uncovered so far, although none of this is completely verified at this point, it is looking very likely that Israel used those 2,000-pound bombs, the ones that Biden has cut off, but they obviously still have some in reserve. They dropped between 5 and 8 of those bombs. They're manufactured by Boeing. And so 2,000-pound bombs, 5 to 8 of them in an area of refugees sheltering in tents. So you can imagine why the death toll is as high as it is, just absolutely unconscionable in terms of how this was perpetrated and the sort of impunity that Israel feels to be able to do it. In the north, we had talked about how Israel had ordered a complete evacuation of Gaza City. That round of fighting is now over, so to speak. Israeli forces have withdrawn from Gaza City and they've left it basically an open graveyard, just total death and destruction everywhere in Gaza City. You can tell when even the New York Times coverage is sort of aghast at the level of horror. There's a lot that happened in Gaza City this past week. There was another attack on a refugee camp that people never really paid much attention to because it happened the same day as the El Mawasi bombing, where another 20 people were killed at a refugee camp. And the UNRWA headquarters in Gaza has now been completely destroyed. So they flattened it while they were in Gaza City, which again, I think we've talked a lot about Israel's desires specifically to make sure that UNRWA itself as an institution doesn't survive this war, because UNRWA exists under the premise that Palestinians exist and have a right to return. So they are really pulling out all the stops to destroy any UNRWA infrastructure that remains in Gaza. There's a story of a particular man in Gaza City that I really debated whether or not to include. And, I go through these articles and I read them before discussing it all with you all. And I have to admit that this is one that I couldn't finish. I got through a chunk of it and, I ended up bouncing through the rest. It got surprisingly little coverage given that the really unspeakable things that happened to this man. Yeah, I won't get into the grisly details because I think everybody here is probably sensitized enough to what the Israeli military is capable of doing. But this one really kind of broke me. The one thing that I do want to acknowledge about this story is that the BBC, when it initially reported the story in the sort of typical Western media way, using the passive verbs and neglecting to mention who is causing the harm, originally posted this story as the lonely death of a Gaza man with Down syndrome. And because of the extent of the outcry of this headline that completely buried what actually happened, did in fact change it to, Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die, which is closer. I think still doesn't really do justice to what happened, but does speak to the fact that at the end of the day, these media institutions, rely on readership and to the extent that we can mobilize to really push them to produce a better narrative works when we're coordinated enough to do that. Inside Israel, the draft of ultra-Orthodox people. So, this Supreme Court ruling that said that ultra-Orthodox folks have to be part of the IDF mandatory military service is now moving forward. We've mentioned in previous PSAs the tension this is causing within Israel's ruling coalition. Netanyahu and his hard right allies are deeply against this because that ultra-Orthodox constituency is his base. or at least part of his base. And folks are terrified of how this is going to like rip apart Israeli social fabric. So they're slow walking the drafting in of Haredi ultra-Orthodox Jews. They've enlisted 1,000, or they've conscripted 1,000, and so there remains, 100,000 or so that they will like integrate in slowly. There are protests happening all over Israel about this, and it seems possible that Netanyahu will be using this as a pretext to kick out the defense minister from the cabinet. So like to fire Yoav Gallant, who is somebody who has been pushing this forward. And again, Gallant, the sort of darling of the US political interests, who they've been like grooming him to replace Netanyahu. Netanyahu sees that and is obviously trying to work around it. So that, like the Unity Coalition already fell apart a month ago. And this is sort of the last piece of it is this Netanyahu-Gallant alliance, which now seems like it might not survive the month. Hard to say, but that's where things are trending. The ceasefire stuff, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, but just to say, like, it's becoming it's already abundantly clear that Netanyahu is trying to sabotage the ceasefire negotiations. He's either changing the language or introducing clauses that the parties absolutely won't agree to, specifically because, again, his political fortunes are tied to this war, and they're like Israel remains in a losing position, and so he can't finalize that war in this position of loss. But he also doesn't have a path to turn it into a position of victory. So we're all stuck here. While that's happening, Hamas continues to try to keep the ceasefire negotiations open. Even after that Al Mawasi bombing, they immediately put out a statement saying that this doesn't mean the ceasefire talks are dead, even though it's clear that Israel is trying to kill the ceasefire talks. There's some more on the dynamics of the ceasefire that we'll come back to, but I did want to take a moment to reflect on this repeating pattern of behavior of the Israeli state, not just under this government, but for its entire history, where acts of political violence are specifically strategically deployed to derail like peace talks. And this isn't just something that happens between the like Palestinian resistance and the Israeli government, but also a long pattern of Palestinian unity talks being undermined by Israeli aggression. So, that Tariq Bakoni book, Hamas Contained, has some really illuminating examples of this, where anytime those unity talks got somewhere, Israel would, launch some giant bombardment in order to derail the talks. So that's another, I think, context in which we need to see these escalating massacres, not only the sort of carelessness and broader genocidal intent of the Israeli government, but also a like strategic attempt to derail the negotiations. On the international sphere, the smaller news is that it looks like the ICC arrest warrants are coming, despite the attempt of both the British government and the German government to delay it or to throw a spanner in the works by questioning the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. It's particularly galling for the new Labour government in the UK, which just won a giant election a few weeks ago and campaigned on withdrawing the Conservative government's petition to the ICC. So they said, we believe that the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction in Palestine. We think like the Conservatives are being overly protective of Israel, and we're going to withdraw our complaint, like the government's complaint. And then once they assumed power, they didn't. They changed their mind. So, just again speaks to the idea that like a pro-Palestine position is a popular one, but political forces still weigh in a way that like, the political system is structured in a way that politicians benefit from being pro-Israel, despite the fact that their constituents are pro-Palestine. So that's the smaller international news. The bigger international news, of course, is this ICJ opinion on the West Bank. This has been a long time coming. This is a totally separate process from South Africa's court accusing Israel, South Africa's suit accusing Israel of genocide. This one was initiated, I believe, last January, if I remember correctly, January of 23. And it was, the UN General Assembly asked the ICJ to weigh in on the legality of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And the result is scathing, like scathing. I mean, I was surprised. I expected it to be quite critical of Israel, but the ICJ opinion that came out today calls the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem illegal, says that it violates both the strictures on obtaining land by force, which is illegal under international law, and violates Palestinians' right to self-determination. That more or less was, I think, broadly expected. Things that were a little bit surprising to me were the order also includes a demand of reparations to Palestinians who have suffered under this illegal occupation, a right of all Palestinians to return to whatever property they were displaced from or whatever costs they've incurred as a result of this illegal occupation. And this is in 1967 Palestine. So we're only talking about Palestinians displaced within the West Bank since 67. But the other surprising thing about this ICJ decision was its near unanimity. So I put the votes in here, and of course the link is in the slides if you want to read it yourself. Like every judge except one considered this to be within the jurisdiction of the court, and then 11 votes to 4 called the Israeli occupation illegal, and that Israel was under an obligation to end the occupation immediately, and that Israel had to make reparations for the damage that it caused. 11 to 4 is really big, and some things even went higher than that. So by 14 to 1, the court ruled that Israel has an obligation to make reparations, which is a shocking number. But even that 11 votes, those 11 include the US judge and the German judge, which I found a little bit surprising. There's a lot of nuance here that we can get into, and maybe Thomas and I will discuss it at the end. But the only judges who voted against it are the Ugandan judge, Seputinde, who has been just very, very Zionist in her orientation from the beginning. And also the judges from Slovakia, Romania, and France. But the fact that you're seeing that level of unanimity across these liberal Western countries is really saying a lot, I think. The implications of this are really big. It's something we can get into. It will not, of course, change the situation on the ground. Tomorrow, the occupation will still be there. And a month from now, it will likely also still be there. But the conditions under which that occupation can continue are now much more constrained than they were before this ruling. And Israel is aware of that, as is the United States. Netanyahu put out a statement saying, that their eternal capital of Jerusalem and the land of their ancestors in Judea and Samaria, which is the West Bank, are theirs by right. So, basically reaffirming the idea that they intend full annexation. And the hard right minister, Smotrich, specifically said that if the World Bank declares these settlements illegal, he said this 2 days ago, that the Israeli government should annex the West Bank entirely, which they've already started doing. So this isn't a really surprising take from him. But the push to sort of flaunt the entire international world order was really on stark display this week. In anticipation of this vote, the Israeli Knesset, their parliament, voted 68-9, so really overwhelmingly, to forever oppose a Palestinian state. And specifically, yeah, against the establishment of an Arab terror state in Israel, not now, not in the future, not unilaterally, not within an agreement. Basically, under no terms can there be a Palestinian state anywhere. The only people who voted against this were the Arab members of parliament, the 9 of them. So like just really digging in deep into the sort of the fascistic, mask off version of this like settler colonial project. There's some wild videos out there of this vote that I would recommend you watching, like, the few Arab members of parliament calling this out as fascism, and they like the parliament members like jeering and dancing and making fun of them. It's a sight to behold. In the context of all of this, unsurprising, we've seen a hell of a week of the isolation of the Israeli state on the global stage. A remarkable article about Israelis suffering, like being unwanted in global tourism sites, getting kicked out of hotels and restaurants and things. The push to ban Israel from participating in FIFA and other international sports. The big academic boycott that continues to grow in scope, and economic effects, including the bankrupting of Israel's southern port, which largely a result of the Houthi blockade, means that like economic trade with Israel is also sort of falling off a cliff. While the rest of the world turns their backs on Israel, we have Biden, who gave another disastrous interview in a string of disastrous interviews, saying that he's, quote, done more for the Palestinian community than anybody, a Trumpy statement to match his like Trumpy turn lately, and one that's completely divorced from reality. And like double down on his self-identification as a Zionist, in a way that, it's possible that that interview is the one that gave him COVID, which gives me a little bit of joy. But just to say, like, I think it's worth reflecting on the extent to which Biden himself is a like singularly Zionist orientation of an individual, which is not to say that the US political class as a whole isn't willing to go to the hilt for Israel. They clearly have been and continue to do. They're like the US government's backing of Israel has been largely unabashed. But I did want to take a moment to reflect on like what that has looked like previously, and even George W. Bush, right, no friend to the Palestinian people, uh, uh, publicly denounced Israel as using heavy-handed attacks when they did kill a Hamas leader that they were targeting, because it resulted in 14 other casualties, right? Like that almost feels quaint now. But that idea that like even for the George W. Bush administration, that level of violence was unacceptable. And, like Reagan, even more so, I think, played a surprisingly critical role of reducing the violence, Israel's violence in Lebanon, calling their invasion of Lebanon a Holocaust, resulting in the Israeli government stopping its attack. So like, I think we have to appreciate that there are levels in which these things operate. So there is like the sort of, baseline Zionism of the US political class, and it's very high. And then there's Biden, who seems to be a level above. And, from like whatever we're hearing from inside the White House, these decisions are driven by him, despite significant pushback by his own staff, who, again, are not friends of the Palestinian people, but at least have a less maximalist orientation to this violence. In the context of that, I think the idea of Biden's withdrawal is important. It's really important, and it presents an opportunity to reshape the Democratic Party's narrative around Palestine. And we've talked many times on the PSAs, I think, about understanding the party as a terrain of struggle, and like this is a moment of that struggle. And not for nothing, it's worth reflecting on the fact that for months now, Kamala Harris has been trying to position herself as more pro-Palestine than her boss. Folks probably remember back in March when she leaked that that the Biden administration told her that she had to tone down her sympathy for Gaza. Like she's been putting out for months. Some of these articles date back to last December. Her trying to signal that she feels differently, like that she feels that the U.S. is not being like its role is being overwhelmingly friendly to the Israeli state. So none of that is to say that that Kamala Harris is in our camp. It is, of course, not to say that Palestinian liberation comes through Kamala Harris, but that it's an opportunity for an intervention that could mean something. And that's not, it looks like if Biden steps aside, it seems like it's going to be an open convention. So who knows who the best person to come out of that process will be. But this is a really important opportunity, I think, to make it a central issue in who gets decided, and the understanding that like the base, as Kamala Harris is sort of cynically doing here, understands that what the base wants to see is more support for Palestine, right? And less support for Israel, militarily and otherwise. So with the DNC convention looming, all of these things feel pretty critical in this moment. The last two things that I wanted to touch on very quickly are just, last week we mentioned that Dropsite did an interview with Hamas that I found to be very illuminating in terms of understanding their underlying motivations and their perspectives. They've done it again this week, but with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This was also a really interesting interview. This one is actually just like a one-on-one interview with Jeremy Scahill. And there's a lot in there about how the ceasefire negotiations are being conducted, and so like how Hamas's side is engaging with this process and how they're bringing in other factions into those conversations. So like it introduced dynamics that I wasn't aware of, and also how Palestinian armed groups are thinking about the U.S. election. Right, there's a lot in there actually about them like weighing what the difference would be from a Trump presidency to a Biden presidency to another Democrat, and like they are grappling with these questions in a way that I think means that we should also be grappling with it. Like it's obviously has material consequences. So it's a call on us to think about those things too. And then the last thing I just wanted to flag was this great Wired investigation about how Google and Amazon have been supporting the tech infrastructure of Israel's genocide in Gaza, and how deeply complicit they have been in all of this. And I wasn't originally going to include this, but I tacked it on this morning after seeing what happened with CrowdStrike, which, if folks didn't see, there was a sort of large outage of this like really key part of the world's internet infrastructure. And because CrowdStrike went down, the bombing campaign in Gaza stopped, right? It stopped like for most of the night because they lack the tech infrastructure to maintain their attacks. So like, the ways in which San Francisco specifically as a city is complicit in all of the ongoing genocide is something that I think we need to leverage more as we try to pull out this military industrial complex and turn us away from this course of militarism. So in sum, oh, I didn't update this with the new info, so my apologies. This is from yesterday, and so much has happened today. Like Israel's really ramping up the atrocities in Gaza for both ideological and strategic reasons. The Israeli political class is fracturing over the drafting of ultra-Orthodox folks into the army. Both the ICC warrants and the ICJ decision, are really speaking to both the continued global isolation of Israel and the waning ability of the United States to matter on the world stage. All of its attempts to block both of those things have failed. And that in the context of that, the world is making big strides in isolating and boycotting Israel, which is a really critical part of getting us to the point where Palestinian liberation is a realistic outcome. And then, the step after that is sanctions, right? So we're hopefully on that path. And yeah, noting that Biden stepping down is an opportunity for a political reset on how Palestine is perceived within the U.S. center. Like, we already know how it's perceived in the U.S. left. We're not really going to move it on the U.S. right, but there is an opening here for us to take. And so my closing upcoming action is Netanyahu may or may not be coming to DC this Wednesday. He's scheduled to speak in front of joint houses of Congress, but the Houthis in Yemen struck Tel Aviv last night with a drone. And so that has sent the Israeli military into quite a tizzy because for all of their, super state-of-the-art Iron Dome, laser detection things, they just did not see this coming until it hit the building that just a block from the U.S. embassy, I think. So Netanyahu, I think, is considering canceling or changing his trip. Either way, whether he shows up or not, I think it's going to be a really, really important opportunity to make people's voice heard on Palestine, to really shame Congress for inviting what is now a certified war criminal to speak in the context of the massacres that have been committed and their total intransigence to even accept mealy U.S. positions on two-state whatever coexistence. So if you can go, or if you know folks who could go, I really suggest that you mobilize them. It really speaks to, I think, the sensitivity of the moment that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, says that protesters, anyone who shouts or goes out of line in Congress, will be arrested, which you're allowed to shout at the president, but you're not allowed to shout at the Israeli prime minister, really speaks to how tense this moment is for them, and the opportunity for it to be a PR disaster for both Israel and the Republicans and the Democrats. If you want to learn more about things that are happening, please check out the calendar. For updates on these PSAs or anything related to them, please text PSA to 833-633-0604. Sorry, Shante. And if you want to read the stories that underlie a lot of this analysis, please check out the Pal Media Tracker. The summary that was sent out today was a real doozy. There's just so much that happened this week, so good opportunity to see all of the news as it develops. You can go to palmediatracker.com/signup. And I think that'll do it for me. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Summer. So in our remaining time, maybe we can do a little bit of contextualizing of this, what's going on with the Biden situation, and then talk a little bit more about what you alluded to, which is, the potential opportunities here. If you don't mind, I wanted to share my screen. I've been scrambling while you were talking to find a couple of these polls, but let me just do that real quick. So this is, the one of the more recent polls on, AP polls on whether or not individuals from various parties want their candidate in or out. And obviously, for Donald Trump, his base, as you can see here, majority wants him out. At least a quarter want him gone, but so that's notable. It's not a complete consensus, but what's telling, and which I've outlined in red here, is that among the Democrats, that the polling indicates that the majority, 65%, want Biden to consider stepping out in favor of someone else. This has been the talk of the week. There is speculation, as you alluded to, that as soon as this weekend, maybe even today, we will hear word that there's confirmation, although I think there are lots of conflicting reports and lots of other information. out there. Part of that is maybe perhaps due to some of what I want to also show here, which is, polls like this recent a poll between Biden and Trump, that's subsequent to his poor performance in the debate, which actually shows them pretty much neck and neck. And obviously there's maybe a little 2% difference there. That's not nominal between them. And then on the other hand, there's also this NPR poll, PBS Marist poll, that it also shows that in a matchup between Harris and Trump, they're also neck and neck. And so we've seen a lot of rancor, behind the scenes. I think for folks that are keeping track, AOC went on IG live stream last night, um, sort of outlining her concerns about switching the nominee. There have been a lot of public discussions about uh, you know, the obvious concerns with keeping Biden in the race. And there, one of the things that's come up on for those that are concerned about replacing him has been this Ohio law, which is something to keep track of because according to this Ohio law, I don't know the actual sort of mechanics of it, but there was concern that um, under the this Ohio law that Biden might not be able to sort of, or a Democratic nominee might be prevented from getting on the ballot in November because the deadline was was moved to August, but was previously earlier. And um, what now has happened is that there's discussion, and there has been ample discussion actually over the last few months of doing a virtual nominating process before the DNC to get the Democratic nominee on the ballot, and that would be Biden. Which wouldn't prevent necessarily the Democrats from then selecting someone else at the convention who would then be on the ballot in November in places like Ohio. So there's concern about that and what the Republicans might do to sort of take advantage of that. It's kind of hard to sort of parse through all this and figure out like what's genuine and what's posturing. Um, and also to with regard to AOC and others, like whether or not the analysis is correct or whether these are sort of like thin arguments. I do think that from the discussions we've had, and I think what a lot of folks maybe who are joining this call might be thinking about is, obviously um, the Democratic Party establishment has been aligned with APAC kind of writ large. But as you were sort of mentioning, I do think that there is a significant difference, and as I alluded to at the top of the program, between having Biden, aka Genocide Joe, be the candidate versus Kamala, for example, or someone else. And so um, yeah, I'm wondering if what you think are sort of some of the strategic questions for the left in this moment. Small questions for you, Sam. But just as you've sort of been reading the terrain together with me, but yeah, in this moment, just to kind of think about, obviously, I think it is important to understand that the Democrats are aligned with APAC in by and large, but it's not uniform, and it's not like there haven't been ceasefire candidates and some movement, and so uh, there is a sense that this could be a significant shift and a reinvigorating shift, notwithstanding some of these other concerns.
Yeah, that's an easy one. Yeah, I think there's a lot here, right? But I mean, I think at its core, part of the reason that Biden's stepping aside in this moment, and I do think it's inevitable at this point. Like I suspect by the
I
end of the
agree.
weekend it'll be over, if not sometime next week. But part of the reason it feels weird maybe is like the popular pressure for Biden to step aside has been here this whole time, right? There's these sort of dual tendencies within the party, and I think they're manifesting now. Um, where, before the nomination process even started, I think, something like 75% of Democrats said they wanted a different nominee. And then obviously when the genocide started, there's been huge pressure on Biden to step aside as a totally illegitimate candidate, that has facilitated the slaughter of tens of thousands of people. Um, and, I think like hearing AOC and others sort of criticize the idea of Biden stepping down, they're touching on a thing that I do think is real, which is that the Democratic Party isn't responding to that pressure per se, at least not directly. They're responding to donors, right? And like whatever corporate pressure that the really controls the party
That's
that
right.
now
Yeah.
feels that their interests are being threatened. And those things aren't obviously so easily disentangled, right? Like they feel that their interests are threatened because Biden's lost a ton of legitimacy. And it's not just because of one bad debate, it's also because he's totally alienated the youth, he's totally alienated folks of color, um, not in no small part due to the support of this genocide, right? And that's something that, Bernie had where was it? I think it was an interview in the New Yorker,
It
backing
was.
Biden, and floated that right at the top, right? That like Biden is not a popular candidate because of what he's doing in Gaza. Um, and so on that level, it does feel bad, right? And I think it speaks to which direction the Democratic Party goes, not whether or not Biden steps down, because that feels inevitable, but when he does, like what piece of the like broader coalition that keeps that party together will be able to sort of influence the way forward. And that I think that'll both reveal itself in who the new pick is. I think it's very likely to be Harris, but who knows? And specifically, like even if it is, who's the VP, right? Does the
Yeah.
VP indicate a rightward shift or a leftward shift? What base are they going to try to appeal to, right? Like the corporate base or like the broad popular base. Um, so I don't know. It's an odd moment. It's a very odd moment, and I think to answer one of the questions that came up on the Q&A, like I don't really. It's not even on us in this moment necessarily to get Biden to step down. It's how do we make sure that the narrative around him stepping down is understood as one of like, yeah, he's old, but also he's just lost legitimacy with a huge swath of the electorate for his like right-wing genocidal policies, and making sure that's centered. That's why I think the protest in front of Congress next week and what's happening at the
Significant.
DNC,
Yeah.
yeah, are really significant.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it is. I think it's true that those opportunities are also sort of I do agree with you. I do think it feels inevitable at this point. And it does feel like it is an opportunity for the left to kind of not only to advance, working class kind of needs and an agenda again, which really feels like it's been suppressed. I mean, I can't think of a campaign slogan for the Biden administration if there is one, other than like, say it ain't so, Joe. I mean, just like sit down, Joe Biden. I mean, I can't, or Genocide Joe is more of the campaign slogan than anything else. I mean, it's not like there's most other presidential sort of campaigns have had something memorable, and there isn't really a tagline for this campaign. And part of that has been centered on his inability to sort of like conduct himself publicly. And so I do think that there's an opportunity thinking about like some of what's happened in France recently, where some populist messaging was constructed on a very short timeline. It's obviously not completely analogous, but there's some lesson there about like the ability to sort of take this sort of dramatic and unexpected moment to reinvigorate the base, the working class base, and particularly, I think, for the left, as an opportunity to play some part in that, and to change the terrain and, as you mentioned before, advance the terrain for Palestine solidarity, right? Like putting that back on the agenda. I do think some of the confluence of things we mentioned today, including the ICJ decision and the ICC warrants, coming maybe with some in rapid succession, um, do feel positive, not despite obviously the horrors of what's still ongoing. Um, so I think we'll keep monitoring what's going on. I think it is there's definitely an opportunity here, and I do think part of that involves like analyzing the terrain a little bit, but I do think it involves like sort of continuing to roll out in a way in which we're representing Palestinian liberation interests and also working class interests as a whole, because they are in fact actually aligned. I think that's our analysis and where we're always coming from, and this is an opportunity to sort of change that prevailing narrative that the Democratic Party is sort of advanced in this horrific 8 months of genocide, which is that it's not responsive to its base. And so um, let's see how it pans out. We'll be back next week to talk through more of this. Thank you again to Shante and Kat, and of course Annie on the back end, and for Sammer for your analysis. And we'll see you again, everyone again next week. Thanks for joining.